Welcome back, everybody. We're going to move on to kind of talk about beliefs, something we've spoke about quite a bit. We've mentioned the B of the GABC framework, and we haven't really defined what these beliefs are within REBT. So we'll maybe spend 10 minutes on doing this and try to get to a place where we have some agreement, Stu.
Yeah, we've touched upon these terms, unhelpful and helpful. I'm sure you've mentioned this kind of robust, inflexible, dogma, these kind of terms. And these are really key when we talk about what these beliefs are. So I guess just, as a preamble before we go into that, or a caveat, is this isn't the practitioner telling somebody this belief is irrational. We've mentioned this in cahoots, this kind of aligned method. That's really consistent in REBT. So it's certainly not a case of, okay, well, this is an irrational belief. The question might be posed is this helping you? And that's what we're looking for here. And we can kind of tell or get an indication of that by the nature of the language that's used and also the strength and inflexibility around it. So with irrational beliefs, Ellis identified that this primary irrational belief of demands. So demands can be kind of characterized by language like should, must, have to, things like this. I have to succeed. I must win. I mustn't be seen in a negative light. Something like that. I should do better. And then this is what we call a primary irrational belief that extends into kind of secondary irrational beliefs. So by having these demands, we then tend to see one of three, or perhaps a combination of, these secondary irrational beliefs that then promote negative consequences. And these secondary irrational beliefs can be categorized as low frustration tolerance, awfulizing, or self-depreciation. So Martin, do you want to tell us perhaps a little bit more about those kind of secondary irrational beliefs and then the emotional consequences that they might promote?
Yeah, so the secondary irrational beliefs, obviously, they're secondary in a sense that Ellis believed that the core belief that we have is a demandingness belief. Demandingness being demands placed on the things that we want. So it's not irrational to demand things. It's only really irrational when we demand the things that we want. Because that's not how the world works. We can get into why irrational beliefs are irrational and why rational beliefs are rational. But these secondary beliefs, Ellis believed that they were kind of derived from that initial belief. I don't really have the same thinking around this, and I don't think the evidence is particularly strong on splitting these things into primary and secondary. In my mind, we have four core irrational beliefs. We have demands, frustration intolerance or low frustration tolerance. We have awfulizing. We have depreciation. You can self-depreciate. You can other depreciate. You can world depreciate. So when we get into those four things, we start to figure out actually they might be related differently to some of the emotions that we can experience. But actually, again, the evidence isn't that strong on that either. A lot of people believe that intolerance might be more likely to lead to something like anger. And there is some evidence that those two are connected. But when you look at the research that's been done, it's just as likely to be related to anxiety and depression as it is to anger. So I don't think there's really compelling evidence that these beliefs necessarily lead to specific emotions. And that's really important because nowhere in REBT theory does it suggest that these beliefs link to specific emotions. What we have to do is go outside of REBT and back to Lazarus to start figuring this out. It is the interaction between G and A which flavours the emotion, to use the term used by Windy Dryden, another pioneer of REBT. The G and the A flavours the emotion. The B starts to dictate whether it's unhealthy or healthy. And that's really important. So Lazarus would say, well, is this situation relevant to you as a human being? Okay, yes. And how would you categorise this situation? Is it an offence against you or somebody you love? Is it an existential threat? Is it a danger? Well, if it's an offence against me or somebody I love, then anger is probably going to be the tone of the emotion, the type of the emotion that we experience. If it's an existential threat, then it's more likely to be anxiety. So this is in our GNA. This is the kind of adversity that we're facing and how it goes against the goal. We're in GNA territory. The B then decides or dictates whether we go unhealthy or healthy in our emotional reaction to it. So it shapes our emotion in that sense. So does that anxiety become something that's dysfunctional? Well, this is an important situation to me personally. I sense some danger. There might be some threat to me. And that would be terrible and awful, and I couldn't stand it. And I must not face things like this. And because I want to be safe and secure, I have to be. Those beliefs then start to dictate emotional reaction. They send it into either healthy or healthy. So when we're thinking about what kinds of emotions are triggered when we experience a certain situation, it's not the B that is shaping that emotion. It's the A that's shaping that emotion. The B is then dictating healthy or unhealthy. And that's definitely a common misconception of REBT, that in some way irrational beliefs cause anxiety. Well, you have to have a belief about something. Those things together generate the anxiety that we experience, not beliefs alone or the adversity alone. It's everything. You have to take all of these things in. It's holistic and it's also evidence-based. When you look at the scientific literature, this is what it indicates to us. There are some things that are more emotionally provocative than other things. There are common situations that people will face which seem to generate anxiety. Well, you can't deny those patterns and say there is certainly a category of events that people will face that tend to lead to anxiety, tend to lead to anger, tend to lead to, being hurt and upset, shame, guilt. It's undeniable that A is super important. It's just that B decides whether we experience a healthy or unhealthy version of that emotion. And we would argue with an RBT that a lot of those adversities are unavoidable. So it's best to fortify yourself against those things to make sure you experience something that's functional.
Sorry, yeah. And one of those things we can do to fortify ourselves is to have this kind of shift from demands to preferences. So you mentioned there about how our goals and the events that surround accomplishment or non-accomplishment of those goals are influenced by the beliefs, and we have to take those into all of those things in consideration, and in equal measure that promote emotional and behavioral consequences. If we can kind of shift our beliefs more towards preferences and resist making those demands, and I'll provide an example in a moment, then we're more likely to have more adaptive emotional and behavioral outcomes. So for instance, because I want to succeed at something doesn't mean that I have to. It doesn't mean that I should do. And so I still have that goal that I want to, and it would be really nice to, and I desire it. But there's no law or empirical kind of evidence to suggest that I must do this or I have to do this. And it certainly wouldn't be the end of the world if I didn't.
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to figure out what you can reasonably apply demands to. And it doesn't make sense to apply demands to things that you want. It makes more sense to apply demands to things that you genuinely have to have or have to do. I have to breathe oxygen. I have to drink water. I have to eat food. You're trying to make that distinction because applying demands to wants, it certainly adds pressure to those things. In fact, there's good evidence to say that it might make it less likely to be achieved because of the emotional consequences that it brings about.
And then what we see is by having those preferences, we tend to experience secondary rational beliefs of perhaps like anti-awfulizing. So I don't like it, but it's not the end of the world. Higher frustration tolerance. I don't want this to happen. I wouldn't like it to happen, but I can tolerate it. I will be okay if it does. And then finally, this self-acceptance. I might fail, but it doesn't mean that I'm a failure as a person or that I'm worth anything less. I still, I'm still a valid, worthwhile human being in light of this failure.
Yeah. So the aim of REBT partly is to help people to take these irrational beliefs, recognize them, articulate them, and then to start to challenge them. And then after they've successfully challenged them, we've figured out why these beliefs don't stack up, then to formulate and start to really self-promote rational alternatives. So we go from demandingness, awfulizing, frustration, intolerance, and depreciation to preferences, anti-awfulizing, frustration, tolerance, and unconditional acceptance.
Mm.
That's our transition, if you like, from the irrational to the rational. But this isn't changing or restructuring anything, because you can't do that. Once you've had an irrational belief, there's no changing it. It's there. It happened. It has a place in time. You can't turn back time and not have that belief. But what you can do is mount evidence against that belief, so that when you have it again, you can counter it with a rational response. So you might say, I have to succeed, I have to succeed, I have to succeed. And you might say, okay, no, look, I want to succeed more than anything. And this is really important to me, and I really want it. But I don't have to succeed. There's no must. There's no must succeed. It's that I want. We often call this cognitive change, cognitive restructuring. That's just words. That's just language. You can't change or restructure anything. You have a belief. You can choose to counter that belief with something that's more rational, or you can choose to not counter it and kind of live in that irrationality and deal with the consequences as they appear.
I really like that, and I think this, challenging it is perhaps something that we'll speak about in another episode about how we do that, and the approaches that Ellis kind of established. Because yes, there are kind of these three principles of how we might dispute beliefs, but the delivery of it is really eclectic, and this is a particularly appealing aspect of REBT, in the sense that people are eclectic, everybody's different, everyone's going to respond to things in perhaps different ways, and that efficiency and this variety of methods that can be used is particularly important for working with people who, of course, we work with, but also in very specific populations where perhaps time is of the essence.
We have a framework here that makes what we do efficient. We're working towards something that is evidence-based, to have some good validity. It's a framework there for us to work to, and that does bring with it some efficiency. But the efficiency of RBT really is with helping the individual to adopt rational beliefs, rational construal of the world, rational ideas, rational philosophies. The efficiency there is, well, if my beliefs to some extent dictate the emotions and behaviours I adopt, then if I really commit to those beliefs, then when I face an adversity, I will by default have functional responses, because I just believe in this way, and that's how I see the world, versus this reactionary. An adversity has happened, right? I need to get my thinking in order to react to this adversity so that I can experience a functional emotion. That's still has some efficiency within it. It's certainly more efficient than trying to get rid of all A's, but it's inefficient in a sense that that's quite difficult for people to do. When you look at the emotion regulation literature, this idea of reappraising is something that people don't necessarily want to do. They would prefer to distract themselves or suppress the emotion. And it's very cognitively taxing. To do that in the moment is quite a difficult thing for people to do, anybody to do. And also, you want to have time to do it. So it's more efficient to align your beliefs with reality, to align your beliefs with rationality more, so that when you do face those adversities, your sort of default reaction is a rational response. It's a kind of a functional response. And for sure, listeners and ourselves will have met people like this who they face adversity and they just seem to be able to move on functionally. Doesn't matter what they face. They don't flap. They just move on. They see the world and themselves in a certain way that it helps them to function through adversity. And that's really what we're trying to do. And that, to me, is where the efficiency of RBT comes in. We're not just helping somebody within a specific context, within a specific A, to respond to that A more functionally. We're teaching them or helping them to become rational responders per se to many of life's adversities. And the way we do that is we help them to shape and self-promote this rational way of thinking, this rational way of seeing the world and seeing themselves.
And in essence, like making ourselves redundant in the process.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that to me, is a fundamental part of REBT.
Mm.
Here are the tools. Here are the skills for you to go and now use.
Mm.
It shouldn't be 3 years later, weekly sessions, constantly going over the same stuff, dealing with every adversity the person faces, and then coming to the consultancy room with those problems. To me, that's not good REBT. Good REBT is, let's work through this example of what you're experiencing at the moment. Let's figure out how to apply that in a meta sense, to meta problems, to adversity per se. How will you react when you face situations that do take you away from your goals? That's the abstraction. That's the meta version of a specific adversity. Let's deal with that. What beliefs do you think we could have that might help us to deal with some of those adversities going forward into our lives? That to me is where the work should go in REBT. Doesn't always have to, but that's, to me, that's the ideal. Then the individual leaves fully armed, fully armed with what can help them into the future. Not to say that the door's closed, never call me again, never email me again. Of course, ongoing support is possible, and it's certainly a good thing to offer. So when we say make ourselves redundant, again, that's an idealized idea. Of course, you'd want to land in that place where the person goes, "I've got everything I need," and they go off into their lives. Whether we get there is a different story, but of course, ongoing support is offered.
Perfect. I think that's a lovely summary, and hopefully we'll be touching upon that more frequently in future episodes.